What would you do if the only thing left of your life fit inside a tin box and the man who burned it down was still smiling at you from behind a desk? In the autumn of 1888, in a stretch of Wyoming territory called Emberlin Creek, a woman named Ruth Calloway stood in the ash of what had been her home, holding that tin box, and she did not cry. She had already done her crying in private in the weeks before the fire, when she still believed there was something left to save. What she had left to do now was walk. Somewhere in this story is a cellar, sealed on purpose by a dead man's own hands, and in that cellar is a truth that a powerful man spent 22 years and a great deal of money trying to keep underground. She found it anyway. But before we get to the cellar, and before we get to the men who came looking for her in the dark, you should know how she got there, because none of it was an accident, and none of it, in the end, was about money at all. If you're settling in for this one, pour something warm, because where we're headed, the nights get cold fast and the truth colder still. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and let's begin. Ruth Calloway was raised by her father, a wheelwright named Amos Calloway, in a low timber shop at the edge of Larkspur Hollow that smelled permanently of linseed oil, hot iron, and the sweet rot of green wood curing under canvas. Her mother had died bringing her into the world, and so it was Amos who raised her not gently, not with any particular softness, but with the steady, unhurried attention of a man who believed a thing worth teaching was worth teaching slowly. He did not tell her he loved her in words. He told her instead, standing at the shaving horse with an ash spoke turning under her small hands, that wood does not lie. Every board, he said, carries the memory of the tree it came from, the way it leaned into a hillside wind for 30 years, the way a branch had once grown from it and been cut away, the slow scar tissue of every season it had lived through before the saw ever touched it. Cut against that memory, he told her, and the wood will fight you, and it will win. Cut with the grain, and it will do the work for you. He said this so many times over the years, at the shaving horse, at the forge, bent over a wagon wheel in a customer's yard, that Ruth stopped hearing it as instruction and started hearing it as something closer to scripture, the kind of sentence a person carries without remembering when they first heard it. By the time she was 19, Ruth could read grain the way other people read handwriting. She could run a bare thumb along raw oak and tell you, before the maul ever touched it, where it would split clean and where it would tear ragged and useless. She learned to steam bend hickory into wheel fellows over a fire pit behind the shop, to true a spoke by eye faster than most men could do it, with a gauge, to listen to the particular creak of a wheel under load and know, from that sound alone, which joint was starting to fail. Amos died in the winter of 1879, taken by a fever that moved through Larkspur Hollow that season and claimed 4 men before it burned itself out, and he left her the shop $11 and a spokeshave with a horn handle worn glass smooth by 30 years of his own grip. She sat with him the last night of his life in a shop grown cold because neither of them had thought to feed the stove, and the only thing he said to her that she would carry the rest of her days was the old sentence, worn down now to almost nothing, spoken so quietly she had to lean close to catch it. Cut with the grain, girl. It goes easier. She did not understand that night that he meant it as something larger than woodworking. She would come to understand it later in a cellar 300 miles from that cold stove, digging through another dead man's carefully packed dirt. She married 2 years later, a quiet, hard-working farmer named Elias Pratt, and brought the spokeshave with her to his land east of the creek, where she raised chickens, kept a kitchen garden, mended wagon wheels for neighbors who couldn't afford the trip into town, and did not think much more about the shop or the fever or her father, because for a good while her life did not require her to. Those were, she would say later, the easiest 7 years she ever lived, and she did not know it at the time, which she supposed was simply how easy years worked. That changed in March of 1887, when Elias was killed on the Cassidy's Ford Road by a runaway freight team, and the entire weight of the farm's debts came due, all at once, to a man Ruth had met exactly twice in her married life, Josiah Pruitt, cattle and land agent, deacon of the Emberlin Creek Methodist Church, and holder of the mortgage note Elias had signed 8 years earlier in a hurry, without reading past the second page. Pruitt did not raise his voice. He never did. That was, people in Emberlin Creek would tell you, the thing that unsettled them most about him. You could not catch him enjoying anything. He sat across from Ruth in his office above the feed store, a narrow room that smelled of cedar shavings and fresh ink, and he explained in the flat, unhurried tone of a man reading out a weather report, that the note carried a penalty clause for late remittance, which had quietly activated 11 months prior, that the accrued balance now stood at $462 against a farm the county assessor valued at perhaps $300, and that he would require full satisfaction within 30 days, or the county would be obliged to execute the lien. He slid a single sheet of paper across the desk, turned so the figures faced her. He did not look at her while she read it. When she asked, evenly, how a debt could grow by so much in less than a year, he told her that arithmetic was not a matter of opinion, and offered her his handkerchief, which she did not take, and which he folded back into his coat pocket without any visible change in his expression. The 30 days ended on the 9th of September, 1887. On the 10th, before dawn, a fire the county warden's report would later describe as of undetermined origin, likely a kitchen ember carried by wind, took the farmhouse, the barn, and every animal and object inside them, sparing only the tin box Ruth had, out of an old habit she could never explain, kept under the bed frame, deed, papers, a photograph of Elias, $41 in coin and small bills, and her father's spokeshave wrapped in oilcloth against the damp. Pruitt's men arrived the following morning with a surveyor's chain to mark the property boundaries for county auction. Pruitt himself came by at noon on horseback and expressed, standing in the warm ash with his boots barely dusted, what he called his sincere sorrow at her loss. He reminded her, gently, that the insurance on the structure, such as it was a policy Elias had let lapse 2 winters back without telling her, belonged contractually, in any case, to the note holder rather than the widow. He did not smile. He never smiled. He simply turned his horse and rode back toward town at the same unhurried pace. He did everything, as though the morning had cost him nothing at all, because it hadn't. Ruth Calloway left Emberlin Creek 3 days later with $41, a tin box, and a spokeshave, and she did not look back at the smoke because there was nothing left in it worth looking at. She went north and west, following the rail spur as far as it ran, and a supply road after that, through country that grew rockier and thinner and colder, with every mile behind her, the grass giving way to sage and the sage giving way, eventually, to bare shale that rang under a boot heel like something hollow underneath. She slept 2 nights on their wagon beds belonging to strangers who asked no questions, and a third under the open sky with a tin box for a pillow. And on the 4th day, she came to a settlement of 4 buildings and a well called Widow's Bench, named, the locals told her without much ceremony, for the number of women who had outlived their husbands in that particular stretch of dirt. It was there, in the cramped office of a county land registrar with ink-stained cuffs and no apparent curiosity about anyone's business but his ledgers, that Ruth spent $13 of her 41 on a quarter section of scrubland with a collapsing farmhouse on it, tax forfeited by a man named Obadiah Kestrel, dead since 1881 without heirs, whose debts to the county had finally exceeded whatever anyone believed the land was worth. The registrar told her, without lifting his eyes from the page, that she had overpaid. She did not think she had. She could not have told him why, only that something in the way he said the dead man's name made her want to see the place for herself. The Kestrel place, when she reached it on foot the following afternoon, was less a house than the suggestion of 1, a dry-laid fieldstone foundation, 2, standing walls of gray, weathered pine, and a roof that had surrendered sometime in the last presidential administration and never gotten back up. The well was fouled with a decade of leaves and 1 unlucky raccoon. The chimney had folded into the yard in a heap of soot-blackened brick, grown through now with thistle. But the foundation was true, dry-laid, square and solid, and the 2 standing walls were plumb cut by a man who had known exactly what he was doing, even if he hadn't lived to see the roof finished over it. Ruth stood in the wreck of it as the light went gold, and then gray, and then the deep blue that comes just before full dark, as she thought about her father telling her that wood remembers the tree it came from, and she found herself wondering, standing on that cold stone, whether the ground under a house remembered things too. She spent her first night there wrapped in a horse blanket under the 1 section of roof still holding together, with the tin box beside her and the spokeshave inside it. Like a small iron animal, she was keeping warm through the frost. The rebuilding began the next morning and did not meaningfully stop for the next 4 months. She started with the roof timber, working alone in the cold with a borrowed handsaw and a system her father had taught her without ever calling it a system. Run your palm along the grain before you trust a beam with your weight. Feel for the give. That means Rod has already gotten in past where the eye can see it. She sorted 3 days' worth of collapsed rafters this way, setting aside the sound ones, mostly the sheltered pieces near the old chimney breast, which had stayed dry, and burning the rest for warmth rather than waste a single hour hauling them off. She reset the fallen foundation stone using a trick Amos had shown her for shimming loose wheel spokes, working thin flakes of shale into the gaps between larger stones until each course locked tight without a drop of mortar, testing each one with her full weight before moving to the next. Her hands, soft from a decade of farm wife work, split open in the first week and bled into her gloves, and then scarred over, and then split again along the same lines through November, until by December the calluses had built thick enough to stop tearing at all. It was during the second week, hauling salvaged pine up a makeshift ramp to reset the north wall's cap plate, that Silas Boone started coming around. Boone ran the only trading post within a day's ride in any direction, a squat, low building he called Boone's Mercantile, though everyone understood it was mostly just Boone, 61 years old, opinionated, and permanently short one customer's worth of company. He had views about a widow woman rebuilding a dead man's cursed house alone, and he did not believe in keeping views to himself. He would lean in whatever doorframe she happened to be working near and tell her the Kestrel place had bad luck baked into the stone, that Obadiah Kestrel had died owing money to half the territory and drinking himself blind the other half, that she'd be a good deal smarter to strip the field stone for building material and go find honest wages in town like a sensible woman. Ruth mostly said nothing back. She let the wall answer for her, instead a plumb line that held a joint that closed clean without a gap you could slide a knife blade into. And after several weeks of this ritual, Boone's mockery took on the tired, almost affectionate quality of a man who no longer entirely believed what he was saying, but felt some old obligation to say it anyway, the way a person keeps arguing after they've already lost the point. The turning point came in late October, when the roof was sound enough that Ruth could turn her attention to the root cellar beneath the house, which Kestrel had used at some point, and then, at some later point, deliberately sealed. This was not collapse. The stairway down had been filled with hauled rubble and packed earth, tamped down in even layers, the kind of methodical burial a man does when he means for a thing to stay buried and has all the time in the world, alone, at night, to make sure of it. It took Ruth 6 days with a spade and a mattock to clear it, an hour before dawn and 2 after dusk, worked in around the rest of her labor because the cellar wasn't urgent to her survival and the roof was. On the 4th evening, Silas Boone rode out, meaning to mock her progress on the new chimney, found her instead waist-deep in a hole full of somebody else's carefully hidden dirt, stood at the cellar mouth for a long, silent minute, and then, without a word of explanation, climbed down and started digging beside her. He never did explain why. Ruth never asked him to. The work in that cellar was slower than anything Ruth had done on the roof or the walls above it, because the fill had been packed in with real care, tamped in layers, no thicker than a hand's width, each layer left to settle before the next went down, the work of a man who had all the patience in the world for concealment and none left over for anything else. She and Boone took turns with the spade and the mattock, one loosening the packed earth while the other hauled it up the cleared stairway in a bucket on a length of rope. And by the 3rd day, their conversation had worn down to the practical shorthand of 2 people who had stopped needing to fill a silence, a grunt for your turn, 2 knocks on the rope for pull. Boone, for all his talk up above, turned out to have a farmer's patience once he'd committed himself to a task, and more than once it was his eye, not Ruth's, that caught the faint difference in the packed dirt's color where Kestrel had evidently run short of his original fill and switched partway down to soil hauled in from somewhere else entirely, a small telling detail that neither of them understood the full weight of until the ledgers explained it to them 3 days later. We leave Ruth's side of the story here, only for a moment, to follow the man who was, at that very hour, riding east from Emberlin Creek on business of his own. Josiah Pruitt did not think of himself as a violent man, and in the strictest sense he was not one. He had not, in 25 years, raised a hand to another human being. He preferred paper. Paper did not flinch, did not bruise, did not leave a mark a coroner could measure. On the evening, Ruth and Silas Boone broke through 18 inches of packed fill in a stranger's cellar 3 days' ride to the north. Pruitt sat in his office above the feed store reviewing a ledger of his own quarterly returns on the mortgage business, a column of names beside a column of figures. Ruth, Pratt's name among them, marked in his small, precise hand, satisfied by fire. He had heard that same week, second-hand and unconcerned, that the widow had bought some worthless scrub acreage up near Widow's Bench. He gave it no more thought than he gave any of the small, inevitable debris a business like his left behind. He had learned long ago that the past, properly managed, stayed exactly where you put it, the same way a note's interest stayed exactly where a man wrote it down, patient and silent until it was called due. He had no reason yet to believe otherwise, and so he closed his ledger, banked the stove, and went to bed untroubled. A man 22 years into believing his oldest secret had gone quietly to ground with the only other person who ever knew the whole of it. He was wrong about that, though it would be some days before he learned how wrong. They broke through to the cellar's original floor on the 6th day, a Tuesday, the last week of October, 1888. Beneath the packed fill, the true floor was fieldstone, and one flag of it, larger than the rest and set slightly proud of its neighbors, rang hollow under the spade's flat blade, the sound, Ruth would say later, of a stone that had something to hide underneath it. Beneath that flag was a cavity lined in dry-fitted slate, and inside the cavity, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle and yellow with age, sat a strong box whose lock gave way to Boone's crowbar on the second strike. Inside were 4 ledgers bound in cracked leather, a bundle of letters tied with wax twine gone stiff as wire, and $340 in territorial banknotes, so old the printing bank behind them no longer existed. Ruth did not touch the money first. She opened the top ledger by lamplight, and Boone, silent now in a way he had not managed to be in 6 weeks, read over her shoulder. It took 3 full days, working at a table made from a salvage door laid across 2 barrels, for Ruth and Silas Boone to make sense of what Obadiah Kestrel had buried under his own floor and then spent the last 7 years of his life drinking toward forgetting. The ledgers were Kestrel's own record-keeping, meticulous in the manner of a man raised to distrust his own memory more than he distrusted paper, and they detailed his employment between 1861 and 1866 as a surveyor and grading foreman for the Territorial Land and Improvement Company, a firm whose principal shareholder, named in Kestrel's own careful hand on the inside cover of the second volume, was one Josiah Pruitt, then 26 years old, and already, it seemed, a man who preferred paper to people. The letters were correspondence between Kestrel and Pruitt, and they were, in their flat administrative tone, worse than any confession Ruth could have imagined reading. In the spring of 1863, the company had contracted to grade a rail bed through a narrow defile above a settlement called Thorn Gulch, a community of 41 families who had declined Pruitt's earlier offer to buy out their claims at what one letter called fair territorial value, 18 cents an acre. The grading work required diverting Thorn Creek into a temporary channel while the roadbed was cut. Kestrel's letters documented, in the careful, self-protective language of a man building his own alibi in advance, that he had warned Pruitt in writing that the channel walls were unstable shale and would not survive spring runoff. Pruitt's reply, quoted in full in Kestrel's second ledger and copied out again in his own hand as though he could not quite believe it either, read, "Proceed on schedule. The company's insurers do not price land they cannot survey." The channel failed on the night of April the 9th, 1863. The flood took the settlement in under an hour. The county coroner's report, filed 11 days later by a magistrate who, Kestrel noted in a small marginal aside, had personally received $400 from the company the previous month, ruled the deaths. Kestrel's ledger recorded the number in his own unsteady hand: 23 souls, 12 of them children, an act of God, an unavoidable spring flood, no party at fault. The company acquired the abandoned Thorn Gulch claims at the original 18 cents an acre within the year. Pruitt sold his interest in the company in 1867 for a sum that, when Ruth and Boone rode 2 days to Widow's Bench to cross-check it against the county land office's duplicate filing, became unmistakably the seed capital for the Emberlin Creek land and mortgage business he still ran 21 years later from an office that smelled of cedar shavings and fresh ink. There was a third document, folded separately from the rest and pressed flat inside the back cover of the fourth ledger, that took them the longest to understand because it was not in Kestrel's hand at all, but in Pruitt's own private accounting, dated late 1867, listing 11 names beside 11 sums ranging from $20 to $115 under the heading Discretionary Settlements, TG. Ruth did not understand it until Boone, turning the county land office duplicate sideways to catch the lamp better, matched 3 of those 11 names to 3 Thorn Gulch claimants who had, according to the recorder's own filing, quietly withdrawn any inquiry into the flood within a year of receiving payment. It was not conscience money, Boone said, turning the page back over. It was the cost of a silence, priced out man by man, the same way Pruitt had priced everything else in his life. Ruth thought of her own $462, arrived at with the same flat, unhurried arithmetic, and understood for the first time that she had not been an aberration in Josiah Pruitt's ledger at all. She had simply been the next entry in a column he had been keeping in one form or another for 25 years. Ruth sat with that arithmetic for a long while, the lamp burning low, $462 in penalty fees on her own note, 18 cents an acre for a graveyard, $20 to $115 for a silence bought 11 times over. She understood, finally, why Obadiah Kestrel had buried this under his own floor instead of burning it in the stove where it would have taken him 10 minutes and cost him nothing, a man too frightened to destroy what he knew and too guilty to ever use it, choosing instead to seal it under stone and drink until the seal held on its own. It did not hold any longer. They rode for Widow's Bench the next morning to find the nearest federal marshal, and that turned out to be their mistake, because word of a woman and a traitor digging 6 days through a dead man's cellar does not stay quiet in country that thin. By the time they reached the halfway point at Quayle's Crossing, 2 riders were already waiting for them at the ford, a hired collections man named Dutch Renner, who did occasional rough work for Pruitt's mortgage office when polite letters failed, and a younger man Ruth didn't recognize, both of them courteous in the particular, unhurried way of men who intend to stop being courteous very soon. Renner asked, mild as milk, whether Mrs. Pratt he used her married name deliberately, the way a man reminds you of an old debt, had found anything interesting out at the old Kestrel place. Boone answered before Ruth could told him they'd found nothing down there but rotten rats, and Renner smiled and said he'd heard different from 3 separate men in 3 separate towns, and that Mr. Pruitt would be glad to take whatever she'd found off her hands and settle her old note, besides generous terms, no hard feelings between neighbors. The storm that had been building over the ridge all afternoon broke while they were still talking, the sudden, violent kind of mountain weather that turns a dry ford into 4 feet of brown, moving water inside 20 minutes. It was the storm, more than anything either side did on purpose, that decided what happened next. In the scramble and the dark and the roar of rising water, Renner's horse spooked and went down hard in the current. Boone, half by instinct and half because he'd apparently decided somewhere down in that cellar that he was fully in this now, put his shoulder into the younger rider before the man could reach the saddlebag, where the ledger sat wrapped in oilcloth against the wet. The rider went down into the shallows, cursing, and did not come up swinging. Ruth got a fistful of Renner's coat as the current carried him past her and hauled him, coughing and furious, up onto the bank rather than let the flood do to him what it had done to Thorn Gulch 25 years before. She would tell Boone afterward that she hadn't decided that out of any particular principle she'd simply move before there'd been time to decide anything at all, and had thought about the principle only later, lying awake. Renner did not thank her. He did, gasping in the mud with rain running off his hat brim, tell her she was a fool to think any court in 3 counties would take a dead man's ledger over Josiah Pruitt's word. They left both riders disarmed, soaked, and walking back toward Emberlin Creek on foot, and Ruth and Boone pushed on through the last of the storm to reach Widow's Bench by first light, the oilcloth bundle riding dry against Ruth's chest the whole way, tied there with a strip of rain leather so she would not have to trust it to a saddlebag again. The federal deputy marshal posted nearest that stretch of territory was a man named Thomas Yarrow, stationed out of Fort Halleck, known up and down the rail lines for a stubborn, unhurried thoroughness that had made him unpopular with every land office in the territory, and trusted without exception by everyone who had nothing left to hide. Ruth laid the ledgers, the letters, and the county land office duplicate on his desk and told him plainly what they showed, start to finish, without embellishment, the way her father had once told her that a true thing needs no decoration to be believed. Yarrow read for the better part of 2 hours without a single comment, sent a wire to the territorial court at Cheyenne, and then sent a second wire, this one to the coroner's office at the county seat, requesting the original 1,863 inquest file be located and forwarded by the fastest writer available. It took him 9 days to build a case he considered unbreakable. Cross-checking every figure in Kestrel's ledgers against bank records, the old company had never bothered to destroy because it had never once occurred to anyone that a dead grading foreman's guilty conscience would outlast them all. On the 10th day, Deputy Marshal Yarrow rode into Emberlin Creek with 2 men and a federal warrant in his coat pocket and arrested Josiah Pruitt in his own office above the feed store in the room that smelled of cedar shavings and fresh ink on charges of conspiracy, fraud, and 23 counts of manslaughter dating to the 9th of April, 1863. Pruitt asked, as they walked him down the stairs past the feed sacks and out into the street, whether all of this was truly necessary given how long ago it had happened. Yarrow told him that arithmetic was not a matter of opinion and did not offer him his handkerchief. Spring came slow to the Kestrel place. Ruth had started calling it Calloway's Rest by then, though she told no one why and no one asked twice. The roof was whole. The chimney drew clean smoke on cold mornings. The cellar, its floor, stone, reset, flush, and its secret finally spent, held potatoes and apples and a crock of preserves instead of a dead man's 22 years of guilt. Word of the ledgers traveled, as such things do, and letters began arriving that spring from the scattered descendants of Thorn Gulch. Families broken apart across 3 territories for a quarter of a century, some wrote for the ledger's sake, hoping for some small restitution out of Pruitt's seized assets. But most wrote simply to be told, at last, what had actually happened to their kin on a spring night in 1863, which turned out to be the thing most of them had wanted all along. Silas Boone stayed on at Calloway's Rest, not as a suitor, though the town of Widow's Bench assumed otherwise, and Ruth, for her own private reasons, let them go on assuming it, but as a working partner in the running of the place, and he stopped entirely and without any ceremony about it, mocking anything she built. When a young couple riding through from Cheyenne asked him that spring whether the old Kestrel place really had been cursed the way folks used to say, Boone thought about it a moment longer than the question seemed to require and told them no, it had only been waiting on somebody patient enough to dig past the part that scared everybody else off. On the first warm evening in May of 1889, Ruth Calloway took her father's spokeshave out of the tin box for the first time since the fire and used it to true a new spoke for a wagon wheel. A neighbor had brought her from 12 miles off the same quiet trade. Her father had taught her at a shaving horse in Larkspur Hollow, passed down now to hands he had never lived to see finished working in a shop he had never known existed. She ran her thumb along the new spoke's grain the way he had shown her 30 years before, feeling for the give that meant trouble and finding none, and she thought, not for the first time that spring, that Amos Calloway had been right about nearly everything except one small thing. Wood does not lie, he had told her over and over until it stopped sounding like instruction. But it turned out paper didn't lie either, not in the end, if you were patient enough and desperate enough and willing enough to dig for it through 6 days of another man's careful dirt. The goal that everyone in this story went looking for, Pruitt in his ledgers, Kestrel in his silence, Ruth in her $13 of scrubland and collapsing stone, was never the true treasure at all. The true treasure was the thing that could not be foreclosed on, could not be sealed under a floor and forgotten. A name finally cleared, a debt finally called due to the right man after 22 years, a house standing true on its foundation because someone had cut with the grain instead of against it, all the way down to the bottom of things. If this story found you tonight, you know what to do. Subscribe, share it with someone who could use a little justice in their evening, and tell me down in the comments, what's the one thing you'd dig through $13 of ruin to find?